Clark to tell Lieutenant Governor the NDP-Green alliance cannot offer stable government. Victoria. Premier Christy Clark says she'll tell B.C.'s Lieutenant Governor that the legislature has no hope of functioning properly under an NDP government, advice that could pave the way for another provincial election. Clark's Liberals are expected to be defeated in a confidence vote on Thursday, and Clark would immediately visit Lieutenant Gov. Judith Gichon to hand in her resignation as Premier. Clark said she won't offer the advice unsolicited, but would respond honestly to questions Gichon might ask about whether the NDP-Green alliance could form a stable functional government with a one-vote margin in the House. "I've got to be honest, you've seen what I've seen this last week. It isn't working," Clark told a news conference on Wednesday. "There is no effort on the part of either party to work together or to collaborate. This isn't a working legislature, and I haven't seen any evidence it could work. If she asks me about that, that's the advice I have to give her, because it has to be an honest conversation." Clark's advice is significant because, as Premier, what she says will weigh heavily on Gichon as she decides whether to call upon NDP leader John Horgan to form government or to send the province back to the polls. The NDP and Greens are expected to combine their 44 votes to defeat the Liberal government at 5:30 p.m. Thursday, and Clark is expected to then immediately visit Government House to speak to Gichon. Clark said British Columbians don't want another election, but she doesn't think the NDP can govern either with 44 votes under a power-sharing alliance with the Greens, compared to the 43-seat Liberals. "If she asks me that question, am I supposed to lie?" she asked. "Or should I just say I am sorry, Your Honour, I can't talk about that?" NDP leader John Horgan said he thinks he's made a credible case to govern, using a written agreement with the Greens for their support on budgets and confidence matters. "I am hopeful she will do the right thing," he said of Gichon. "We should be given an opportunity to govern." Clark told Post Media News last week she had no intention of giving any advice to the Lieutenant Governor if she was forced to resign. Constitution experts were highly critical of that stand. The public statements that the Premier will cease to provide advice is deeply troubling and a serious dereliction of her duties, said Eric Adams, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Alberta and an expert in constitutional matters. The underpinnings of a responsible government are based on the Lieutenant Governor receiving advice from elected officials. "Advice can happen in a conversational way between Gichon and Clark," said Adams. "It doesn't have to be formally stated." Clark doesn't have much of choice if she's asked by Gichon for her opinion, said David Smith, a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, who has written several books on constitutional matters. The Lieutenant Governor, the Crown's representative, is in a position to expect advice if asked for it, he said. "I think to sit there mute would be not an option." Clark's statements are also significant because it would be unconstitutional for Gichon to call a new election without Clark's advice, said Adams. "My advice to her would be that, no, she needs the advice of her First Minister to dissolve the legislature," he said. "Let's step back for a minute. That makes perfect sense. We don't want the alternative precedent of lieutenant governors deciding on their own that things seem a bit unstable out there. Time for an election. That's not their call or responsibility." If Clark goes out of her way to avoid advising a new election, Gichon would be left with very few options other than to turn to Horgan, said Philippe Lagasse, an associate professor at Carleton University and a specialist on issues involving the Crown. "Her first duty as Crown is to have a First Minister to proffer advice," he said. "So she'd necessarily turn to Horgan as leader of the second largest party to form a government. Gichon can't just call an election by herself without Clark's advice," said Lagasse. "Nor can she run the government if Clark resigns," he said. "A Premier will need to be in place. The LG is going to start making these decisions on her own. It doesn't fit with how it works. The LG's discretion is to refuse a request for dissolution, not to trigger one," he said. Horgan, meanwhile, is likely to get a call late Thursday to come to Government House for a conversation with Gichon. She'll ask him whether he can govern, and she'll be obliged to take his word, said Andrew Hurd, a political science professor at Simon Fraser University who specializes in constitutional matters. If the NDP claim that they will be able to work within the rules, or change the rules in minor ways to allow it to work, she does in fact need to take that assurance, said Hurd. It is a duty on the Lieutenant Governor to allow the House to run its course. Especially with this evidence in hand of an agreement signed by a majority of NDP and Green members, it is clear that there is a viable alternative. Peter Russell, a constitutional expert from the University of Toronto, said he expects Gitchon to at least let Horgan try to govern. Her main function is to try to honour the decision the voters of B.C., said Russell. My guess will be she'll give this Legislative Assembly a chance and not dismiss it out of hand as unworkable, and let the NDP govern with a pledge of Green support and see what it can do. Meanwhile, Speaker Steve Thomson largely sidestepped Wednesday giving his opinion on whether it's appropriate for a future Speaker to repeatedly break tie votes under an NDP government. In a letter to both Liberal and NDP House leaders, he said he wouldn't influence Gitchon's deliberations. Gitchon will be gathering all the facts and listening to concerns about issues like the future of the Speaker in a potential NDP government, but experts generally agree she'll avoid prejudging whether a Horgan government could work. If I was giving her advice, it would be there's no reason to assume dysfunction before it occurs, said Adams. There may be partisan forces trying to suggest we guarantee this will be dysfunctional, but to my mind systems of government have a way of working and that, especially on the heels of an election that occurred so recently, this legislature has the right and the duty to attempt to function. Making assumptions before it occurs that this legislature is unworkable, I think, is unwise. Thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe to our channel for daily videos.